It's difficult anytime you're sort of thinking particularly, about a story. Where does it begin, as an author? Because so much of the process of writing a novel is you're sort of groping in the dark to figure out exactly what it is you're trying to say and what your characters are trying to say. And, this book obviously is written from the perspective of an Afghan. And my experience in Afghanistan, it was a little different in so much as the entire time I was serving there, going in and out between 2008 and 2011, I worked exclusively as an advisor to Afghan troops. So as much as, many of my war buddies were, the other Marines and service members I fought alongside, they were often, in significant respect, the other Afghans, the ones I advised. And we did all the things fighting men have always done together. We fought together, we bled together, we mourned friends together. But upon coming home, I knew I would never see any of these Afghans again, sort of trapped as they were in their country's elliptical war. So these weren't a bunch of guys I could keep up with on Facebook, call long distance or go get like quarter beers with at the local VFW. So in writing a book from their perspective, I realized, I wanted to render the war as best I could how I think that they might have seen it. And for me, I think it was also a process of sort of reckoning with a loss and trying to tell their story and what was a last act of friendship. I think one of the challenges that we've seen in Afghanistan, and this is one of the challenges inherent with any type of counterinsurgency, it goes back to sort of famous words. And if you've ever read Mike Sheehan's book, A Bright Shining Lie, about Vietnam, which talks about John Paul Vann, who was a State Department officer who spent, I believe, just 12 solid years there. He said, the problem with the Vietnam War wasn't that we fought a 7-year war, it's that we fought 7 one-year wars. So I think, those 8-month, year-long deployments, you have guys who, give all you could give in an 8-month or year-long deployment. But as I always saw, too, the Afghans knew the game. The Taliban had the saying, you all might have the watches, but we got the time. And that's true. And they would see the rotations, and they understood that. So that, in terms of manpower, I think was a challenge, and I don't think there is an appetite to send Marines to Afghanistan for 5 years or for the duration of the conflict. So that's something that hamstrings you. But in terms of professionalism, Marines' ability to do forward internal defense as well as someone in Army Special Forces, absolutely. One of the things that was very interesting for me working in Afghanistan was I worked both with the Afghan National Army and then later when I was a paramilitary officer with certain units that were basically CIA-funded units. And one of the differences was those units were worked for the U.S. government and were not under the Afghan National Army construct. So the ANA construct was, which makes sense, we sort of made them in our image. This is a national army for the nation of Afghanistan. People were recruited from all over the country. So if you were in Helmand province, you might have soldiers from Mazar-e-Sharif in the north working down in the south. It was really built along those lines. Whereas the units we worked with, once I was out of the ANA, were units that were recruited on a tribal basis. So everyone was from the same tribe, more or less. They were all locally recruited. Now, granted, one of the concerns to that had always been, in recruiting in that way, was, well, ultimately, that can lead to warlordism, where you really see a feudal security construct. But those units were infinitely more effective than the ANA, because if, Lance Corporal Snuffy is being an idiot, his fire team leader is probably his second cousin, and his second cousin, is going to enforce a level of tribal and familial discipline that you just didn't really have in the ANA. And so seeing that difference was very stark, and it was something that wasn't intuitive to me until I saw it firsthand. But specific to your question, I think a lot remains to be seen. I haven't been to Afghanistan since 2011, though I have many friends who still travel in and out of there. And many of them are actually surprisingly optimistic that the center is going to hold in Afghanistan. And these are people who, I don't count as very Pollyannish. So I think we'll see. I hope so. I think that corruption among the Afghan government has always been rampant. And it's been a huge challenge of the war there, is how to, and I don't know if it's something that you're ever going to necessarily eliminate, but how do you keep it at manageable levels? I think what they call bakshish is just sort of a part of getting politics and business done. But how do you get it to a point where it's not crippling and paralyzing the government? And I think so much of what we've been trying to do in Afghanistan too, is somewhat anathema to the Afghans, which is they've never really had a strong central government. So how do you how do you work from the top down when the organs of government don't really reach out into the provinces? I think that's a big challenge. I think the corruption is something that also factors into that. But I think when that level of corruption impedes the efficacy of the Afghan government, and that people at the local level where the Taliban are taking root, when you're trying to make the argument you should support the Afghan government, and they say, what has the Afghan government done for me? I don't see any Afghan government here. And the reason they don't is because it's dysfunctional. I think then that really bolsters the Taliban when they can say, look at us, like we're here, we're making things happen. So it's a real challenge and has been for a while. I think the best thing that happened to Afghanistan is ISIS. And what I mean by that is, the precipitous withdrawal out of Iraq, I believe, was a huge mistake. Not necessarily because I think if there had been 10,000 troops there, U.S. troops that would have gotten in a line and fought ISIS, but I think it was a very powerful signal to particularly the Sunnis in the region who'd stood up with the U.S. and the coalition during the awakening that the Americans are pulling out of here, that we no longer see this as an area of interest. And so you had the Shia government in Iraq, which was being bolstered by the Iranians, Maliki's sort of corruption. You had the Kurds in the north who have always been a little bit on their own program. And the Sunnis basically had no one to ally themselves with, and Maliki's government was really taking them to the ringers. And so that construct left a vacuum, and that vacuum was filled by ISIS. And I think we've all seen that play out. So when I say it's the best thing that ever happened to Afghanistan, I hope, although no one is saying this publicly, the lesson within the administration has been learned that a precipitous withdrawal from Afghanistan could leave the same type of political power vacuum where the Afghan government that's left behind really feels like it has nobody backing them up. And whether it's the Afghan Taliban bolstered by the Pakistani Taliban, you would see a very, very rapid descent into chaos in Afghanistan. I don't think we're going to see, and I think current indicators are, that we're not going to see a precipitous withdrawal out of Afghanistan. I think that's probably directly the result of events in Iraq the past year. But I think if you look at Afghanistan, there's always been a tension between the central state and all of the regional powers. And I think the efficacy of a government that works there is understanding how to manage that balance between local power brokers and centralized power brokers. I don't think we got that balance right. I think we put too much credo in the government in Kabul. I think we're at a little bit of a point of reckoning to what type of country do we want to be? How do we want to be seen abroad? We've just come out of, or in the process of wars, 15 years of war that have been structured in a way wars have never been structured before, in so much as you had the national mobilization of the Second World War, people buying war bonds and a real national call to service, to the draft of the Vietnam War. Each war has its own construct to these wars fought by an all-volunteer military, and funded largely through deficit spending, so there's an increase in taxes so people don't feel them. And as much as right now in the news there seems to be sort of this debate, should we send troops to fight ISIS? I think Senator Graham had remarks for General Dunford the other day to that effect. It's a conversation that kind of really doesn't affect most of the country except for those who are wearing a uniform, and those are all volunteers. And it makes it very easy to go to war. And I'm not going to necessarily say whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I think we need to talk about it because it definitely bears on who we are as a nation if our path going forward is going to be to fight wars in this way. And I think if we continue fighting them in this way, you'll see 50-year wars. I don't know if that's necessarily who we want to be. So the title of the book, Green on Blue, refers to the ubiquitous insider attacks we've seen in Afghanistan where, green friendly troops, an Afghan will turn his rifle on blue American troops and kill them. So for me, the construct in many respects was to take something which at face value is sort of the most insidious thing that you could do, which is, a betrayal of someone who's trusted you, and to try to peel back the onion on that decision and show it through all of its levels and complexity so that by the time the reader is witnessing this green on blue attack, they might not agree with it, but they at least sort of understand the reduction of motivations. So all the way down, you see how the person who's engaging this attack is presented with this choice and how it makes sense to them. And to me, I think that's just an act of sort of building a bridge and trying to relay the war in a very pragmatic way, as it pertains to Afghans. So in some respects, that was really the book's ambition, was to try to give a glimpse into the war through Afghan eyes, and the inspiration of doing that was trying to render how I thought my friends, the Afghans, saw the war. I think Syria is a failed state now. One of the things that's impacted me the most in observing and writing on the war is is getting to know a lot of the Syrian activists. This is sort of the educated diaspora that was forced to flee the country, but these are the ones who started the revolution in 2011 with very high-minded and democratic ideals. And as we've gotten to, one fellow of my, a friend of mine in particular, a guy named Abed, who used to work at the British consulate, speaks English with a perfect British accent. He, as I got to know him, you can see he feels at the same time such defiance about the cause. That the Free Syrian Army is still fighting. We should support this cause, and we should support them. The idea of democracy in Syria cannot die. And then 2 hours later, you can talk to him, and he'll say, I regret the revolution. I wish we'd never done it. I wish we'd left Assad alone. I would still have a home then. That's better than what I have now. And what you see, is someone, him, others. These are people who have basically become ideologically dispossessed. They had a cause, and it was a good cause, and one they believed in, they sacrificed in, and it's pretty much eroded in front of them. But one of the things that's been interesting to me is, as I look back on my war starting in 2003, particularly in the early days, there was a lot of high-minded ideology there. The idea of, could we bring democracy to this part of the world? Could we liberate them from the forces of extremism? And if I look back, I've been dispossessed of that ideology as well. And so as I sit there with a fellow like Abed and we talk, we sip tea or smoke cigarettes late into the night talking about our wars, we realize that the forces that have dispossessed us of this ideology are in many ways, the forces of radicalism, forces of radical Islam in particular. ISIS is Al-Qaeda in Iraq. I fought against Al-Qaeda in Iraq. ISIS dispossessed his cause. And so in that vein, I'll sit across from a Syrian revolutionary from the early days, and we're actually, in many respects, veterans of the exact same war. The idea that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So that, to give you one observation that surprised me, that was something I didn't expect to find when I was down there.
Thank you.